Imagine the moment when Crispin Wilcox, the self-appointed tyrant, finally realizes he's lost control. The fire rages in the stables, incriminating. Letters are swapped in his own ledger room, and the entire settlement stands on the brink of rebellion. That explosive confrontation where every secret he's carefully guarded for years unravels, sets the stage for a riveting story filled with betrayal, courage, and redemption. If that sounds like the kind of high-stakes drama you can't resist, you'll definitely want to hear how it all unfolds and reaches a conclusion you won't see coming. But don't stop here, there's much more to the tale. Daring escapes, unexpected alliances, and the resilience of those who refuse to let fear win. Stick around. Support us by hitting the subscribe button on our channel and follow the entire saga from start to finish. Because trust me, you won't want to miss the payoff that only comes once you've experienced the entire journey. Frost clung to the ragged edges of the mountain pass, turning each breath into a cloudy ghost in the early light. Three women huddled near a pitiful fire on the edge of that icy wilderness, knowing full well that the settlers who had cast them out intended for them never to be seen again. Harriet Nichols, her fingers trembling with equal parts cold and fury, clutched a small worn journal bound in faded leather. She had once been a school teacher in the very settlement that exiled them, writing lesson plans in that same book. Now the pages chronicled the horrors they had endured at the hands of Crispin Wilcox and his followers. Beside her lay Ada Fletcher, her left arm heavily bandaged from a bullet wound that nearly killed her and did kill her husband, Arthur, before she could intervene. Ada stared into the dying embers, her dark hair matted with the soot of endless nights, sleeping on bare ground, a far cry from the farmhouse she and Arthur once dreamed of building. The third woman, Lucy, Brennan, barely out of her teens, perched with rifle in hand at the perimeter of their makeshift camp. The once hopeful bride-to-be of the settlement, Lucy's cheeks were hollow with hunger, yet her eyes glowed with the steely resolve forged by betrayal. All three women bore the indelible marks of Crispin Wilcox's cruelty, the man who had promised them a haven in the frontier but delivered only tyranny cloaked in pious sermons. They had witnessed the settlement's slow decline into a twisted regime where Wilcox's word was law, and those who questioned him soon vanished. Lucy's father had been among those who disappeared after doubting the settlement's policies. Harriet, suspecting corruption, had collected supplies of her own reams of hidden notes and thorough records of Wilcox's misdeeds, evidence she planned to take to authorities in the nearest real town. But Crispin's network of enforcers, devout men who believed in his so-called sacred mission, caught wind of her intentions. In the chaos of that night, Harriet, Ada, and Lucy were seized, labeled traitors, and loaded into a wagon that trundled them miles away from any known trail. They were tossed out in the darkness with almost no supplies left to freeze, starve, or be devoured by predators. As the wind howled among the pines, Harriet resumed writing in her journal. She documented how Crispin Wilcox's settlement had begun with hopeful families drawn by his promises of abundant farmland and a godly community. Wilcox's honeyed words and borrowed scriptural phrases convinced settlers that he alone held the wisdom to guide them through the perils of the frontier. Over time, ration shortages and disappearances were blamed on external threats, never on Wilcox or his loyal men. When Harriet tried to expose his theft of vital supplies, Crispin branded her an agent of chaos. Ada, newly widowed after Arthur attempted to intervene, stood by Harriet's side, refusing to accept Crispin's decrees. Lucy, who had narrowly escaped a terrible fate at the hands of one of Wilcox's men, took her chance and fled with them into the night. The fire crackled low as Lucy glanced at the horizon. Wolves or mountain cats might lurk in the shadows waiting to test the weakened trio. Ada clung to a half-burned piece of pine to keep the flames alive. Harriet looked grimly at her near-empty satchel of rations. Whatever they had left wouldn't last more than a couple more days. At that very moment, over the crest of a nearby ridge, a rider appeared. His silhouette in the dawn light showed a broad-shouldered man leading a sturdy horse. None of them yet knew he was Wyatt Hayes, a wandering cowboy with scars of his own, both physical and spiritual, who understood Crispin Wilcox's cruelty more intimately than they could imagine. And none of them knew how that chance encounter would spark a flame of justice in the unforgiving mountain snows. Wyatt Hayes tugged lightly on the reins of his bay mare, scanning the narrow pass with an air of caution, born from hard experience. The morning chill seared his lungs with every breath, reminding him how quickly this mountain territory turned lethal for the unprepared. At a distance, he spotted three figures crouched around a meager fire. The rational part of him cautioned that this could be an ambush. Another part, one tempered by remorse and guilt over a past he couldn't outrun, pushed him onward to investigate. As he drew closer, he could see their plight plainly. These women were half-starved and Poorly dressed against the cold with injury etched in every grimace and movement, Ada Fletcher was the first to notice Wyatt's approach. Fear flickered across her features, but she did not cower. Instead, she rose unsteadily as if daring any threat he might pose. Harriet Nichols followed her journal clutched protectively to her chest. Lucy Brennan, rifle at her shoulder, glanced toward Harriet, silently asking if they should stand and fight or beg for mercy. For a few beats of time, the four stared warily at one another, the wind carrying the faint echo of distant wolves. Wyatt dismounted slowly, making sure to move with deliberation so as not to alarm them. He raised his hands to show he carried no weapon. "I ain't looking to rob you," he began, his voice quiet but resonant. "Name's Wyatt Hayes. These mountains can be mean, and from the looks of things, I reckon you've met their worst side." He surveyed their pitiful camp, taking note of Ada's bandaged arm. "There's a half-day ride to some decent shelter from here. If you've got the strength to travel." Harriet studied the man's face, searching for hidden malice. She'd seen Wilcox's men pretend kindness before, only to reveal their vicious intentions. But something in Wyatt's eyes and the subtle lines around them spoke of genuine empathy. Lucy kept her rifle ready, finger near the trigger, while Ada weighed her options. Could they trust another stranger? After all, Crispin Wilcox had once seemed trustworthy too. It was Harriet who finally broke the taut silence. "We were exiled from the Wilcox settlement," she said through chattering teeth. "Left to die here." Wyatt's eyes narrowed at the mention of Wilcox's anger, flickering in his gaze like a gust fanning embers. "Crispin. Wilcox," he confirmed, a voice. "Grim man's done a lot of harm." "I know," exhaled the puff of vapor swirling in the cold air. "Let me guess, you stood up to him and he didn't like it." Ada nodded gingerly, lifting her injured arm. "My husband tried to defend me. Crispin's men shot him in the back." Her voice broke for a moment before she continued. "He died trying to protect us." Lucy stepped closer, lifting her chin. "We were forced out in the middle of the night, threatened with worse. If we ever returned, I doubt we could survive much longer on our own." Wyatt ran a palm over his horse's neck, deliberating. "I can take you to a better spot. There's an old trapping cabin, not far from here. It's not luxurious, but it'll keep out the wind. After that, we talk. There's much to be done if you want to stop Crispin Wilcox for good." Harriet's heart thumped in her chest. She had only hoped to survive. Could Wyatt be suggesting that Crispin's reign of terror might actually be ended? Lucy raised the rifle from her shoulder but did not lower her guard. "We'll listen," she said, voice steady. The stage was set for an alliance forged in desperation and steeled by the shared hatred of one man's tyranny. The cabin Wyatt promised was more a half-buried shack built against a rocky outcropping, concealed by conifer trees whose branches draped with frost. Still, to Harriet, Ada, and Lucy, it looked like paradise after weeks exposed to the raw elements. The wind barely penetrated its thick wooden walls, and a stone hearth sat waiting to be lit. Wyatt tethered his mare nearby and helped gather enough kindling to kindle a much-needed fire. As the warmth spread, Ada sank onto a makeshift stool, with a sigh of relief pressing her palm against her throbbing arm. Wyatt rummaged through his saddlebag, producing a tin of boiled bandages and a small kit of medicinal herbs. "Used to ride with a doctor back in Texas for a time," he explained quietly. "Never became one myself, but I can patch a wound." Lucy watched with curiosity, her rifle now leaning against the wall, still within reach. Harriet nodded approvingly as Wyatt carefully unwrapped Ada's injury, examining the bruised, inflamed flesh. Under a layer of cloth, the bullet wound had mostly clotted, but infection threatened. Harriet clenched her jaw at the memory of Crispin's men gunning down Arthur, Ada's husband, and then tossing her Lucy and Harriet out like refuse. The talk soon turned to Crispin Wilcox. Wyatt had his own reasons for despising Wilcox, though he gave only vague hints. "At first, I've seen firsthand how that man manipulates folks. He uses fear like it's a branding iron, marking people's souls," Wyatt said, placing a poultice on Ada's wound. "I lost good friends because of him." Harriet listened intently, deciding how much to reveal of her own knowledge. She explained how she had begun compiling Crispin's misdeeds, supply ledgers that didn't match land deeds, suspiciously signed over the stifling of any independent council or communal vote. Lucy, who'd been silent, finally spoke up. "You said you want to do more than survive," she ventured. "Do you really think Crispin can be stopped? He's practically got an army of zealots by now." Wyatt's gaze flickered, a glint of determination in it. "He can be. It won't be easy, but men like Crispin build their power on lies. You shine enough light on those lies and the structure cracks." Harriet's eyes drifted to her leather journal. It contained raw written proof testimonies from settlers who disappeared evidence of Crispin's manipulations. Everything Crispin had tried to burn, she had managed to save the journal in the frantic exodus the night they were cast out. Wyatt stood and fed more wood into the hearth, stirring up sparks that danced in the cabin's gloom. For now, you rest. When Ada's arm is stable, we move to safer ground. I know a place that Crispin's lackeys rarely tread up along a ridge beyond the ravine. We'll need supplies, food, weapons, medicine, and then we can start gathering allies. Others must be fed up with Crispin. We find them, unite them. That's how we break him. Harriet traded glances with Lucy, who simply nodded. Ada, wincing as Wyatt adjusted the bandage, offered a tired smile. All right, she whispered. No more just surviving. Let's fight for what Crispin stole from us. Outside, a bitter wind howled through the pine branches, but inside the small cabin, a new warmth flickered the flame of a cause, a collective oath that Crispin Wilcox would face a reckoning. They had no illusions that it would be swift or simple, but for the first time since being abandoned to die, hope quickened their hearts. Snow fell through the pines in slow, swirling curtains as Wyatt led Harriet, Ada, and Lucy up a hidden trail into higher country. Days had passed since they left the ramshackle cabin, and in that time Ada's wound began to heal under Wyatt's careful ministrations. Lucy had grown more proficient, with a rifle practicing every day, with whatever ammunition they could spare. Harriet, for her part, mapped their route meticulously in her journal. And each evening she documented Wyatt's recollections of Crispin's outrages, a litany of theft, intimidation, and murder. At dusk, they neared a natural rock formation that resembled a jagged crown. A narrow gap in one of the spires revealed a sheltered hollow, large enough for a campsite protected from the worst of the wind. Wyatt dismounted and signaled for the others to do the same. The horses, though weary, seemed relieved to stand on more level ground. Without waiting for invitation, Lucy moved to establish a perimeter, scanning the area for tracks or signs of Crispin's patrols. We're safe here, Wyatt murmured, at least for the night. As they set up camp, Harriet approached him, uncertain whether to ask what weighed on her mind. You mentioned you've lost friends to Crispin, she said, voice hushed to avoid carrying across the thin air. If it's not too painful, can you tell me more? Wyatt's jaw tightened, and for a moment Harriet feared she'd overstep, but Wyatt nodded, settling onto a low stone and motioning for Harriet to join him. He described a time years ago when Crispin Wilcox was just another frontier preacher traveling from one settlement to the next, winning hearts and minds with stirring sermons and grand promises of building a righteous community. Wyatt had been entranced like so many others. He followed Crispin to the new settlement, laboring to construct barns and a meeting hall in exchange for Crispin's pledge that everyone would share in the fruits of their work. Over time, Crispin's veneer of benevolence cracked, revealing a tyrant who demanded utter obedience. Questions were silenced, rivals branded heretics. One night, Crispin's men set fire to the barn, owned by Wyatt's friend, who had dared to object to Crispin's taxes. The friend's wife and 2 children died in the blaze. Wyatt's eyes flared with old anger. By the time I tried to stand up against Crispin, he had too many men in his pocket. The settlement was half convinced that if Crispin fell, we'd all be damned. I managed to escape. Others who tried weren't so lucky. He went on to describe how Crispin had twisted religious rhetoric into a weapon, how every challenge was met with deadly force. Harriet thought of her own experiences, how Crispin manipulated scripture to justify tossing Harriet and the other women out for daring to speak. She felt a tightness in her chest that was equal parts rage and sorrow. Lucy returned from her scouting. No sign of Wilcox's men, but we should keep someone on watch anyway, she reported. Ada was tending to the fire, her face set in quiet determination. Harriet, feeling a renewed sense of urgency, flipped open her journal. Wyatt, if we gather more accounts from folks Crispin has hurt, we might have enough evidence to get lawmen involved. Not the local sheriff, who's likely on Crispin's payroll, but maybe the territorial judge. Wyatt tossed a pine branch onto the flames. I'm not against official justice, Harriet, but Crispin's got a knack for bending the law to his will. We'll need a lot more than just testimony. We'll need courage from the settlers themselves. Harriet nodded, glimpsing Ada's pained but resolute expression. Ada would be the face of that courage, her bullet scar, her slain husband's memory, all testaments to Crispin's cruelty. Step by step, Harriet said, forcing a small, hopeful smile. We'll make Crispin answer for everything. Before the sun rose, Lucy startled awake to the low growl of Wyatt's mare. It was not a full whinny, but a tense warning. She slipped from her bedroll rifle in hand and crept to the edge of the hollow. Distant shapes glinted in the moonlight, 4 riders picking their way across the rocky expanse. Crispin's patrol. Lucy's heartbeat hammered in her ears. She signaled Harriet. Ada and Wyatt awake. Wyatt didn't need more than a glance to understand the situation. They hurriedly covered the campsite with brush, dousing the fire and brushing away footprints. Harriet helped Ada move behind a rock outcropping, while Lucy took a sniper's position behind a ledge. Wyatt signaled for silence. As the riders drew closer, Lucy could hear them talking. "Might have gone this way," one man said. "Could be those runaway women Crispin's after." Another voice replied, "Don't see how they'd survive this long. Wilcox figures they're dead by now." Lucy felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. They were very much alive. For a moment, it looked like the patrol might pass them by. The men dismounted to water their horses at a nearby rivulet. Too close for comfort, one rider, a man Lucy recognized from the settlement, August Hale Crispin's most fervent lackey, wandered toward the hollow, as if drawn by an unexplainable pull. Harriet's pulse raced. If August peered around the boulders, he'd spot all 4 of them. Lucy braced her rifle fingers, slipping onto the trigger, ready to do whatever had to be done. Suddenly, Wyatt moved with uncanny swiftness from behind the brush, stepping into August's path with a quick pivot of his forearm. Wyatt slammed August's rifle barrel skyward, preventing him from firing. The other 3 patrolmen reacted instantly, shouting warnings. Lucy squeezed off a shot, taking down one man before he could draw fully on Wyatt. Harriet flung a handful of dirt and small stones at a second rider's face, giving Ada the opening to tackle him to the ground. Meanwhile, Wyatt wrestled August for control of the rifle until Lucy rushed forward and struck August's knees from behind, sending him sprawling. 2 of Crispin's men were wounded and scrambling to escape. The third lay unconscious, courtesy of Ada's surprise takedown. August, pinned beneath Wyatt's weight, cursed them with vivid language. But Harriet, Lucy, and Ada quickly searched him for weapons. They found 2 knives and a letter from Crispin, instructing August to scour every pass and deliver swift judgment on any traitors. With the immediate danger subdued, Wyatt eyed Lucy's rifle in quiet approval. "Good shot," he said. Her face held a hint of shock. Taking another life, or wounding a man, was a harsh reality. Harriet placed a hand on Lucy's shoulder as if to say, "You did what was necessary." Ada, breathing heavily, inspected her own bruised forearm. "That was closer than I'd like," she muttered. Now they had to decide what to do with August and the unconscious man. Killing them outright felt monstrous, yet setting them free. Risk Crispin learning their location. Wyatt tied the prisoners together with rope from his saddlebags. "They won't freeze tonight. They can free themselves in a few hours," he said matter-of-factly. "Long enough for us to get out of reach." Harriet nodded, still trembling from the adrenaline. She wondered if Crispin might send an even larger group next time. They gathered what supplies they could: extra rifles, a half-filled canteen. Lucy, scanning the horizon, bit her lip. "They'll be back with more men. Crispin will never let us roam these mountains now that he knows we're alive and fighting." Wyatt, adjusting his own rifle, nodded in grim agreement. "Then we'll have to be 2 steps ahead of him. We'll move at first light." Behind them, the subdued prisoners cursed in muffled fury, but Harriet could only think. If Crispin has discovered we're still alive, the final showdown is no longer a question of if, but when. High above the canyon floor, the wind was sharper, carrying flurries of snow that danced in the weak daylight. Harriet led the way along a precarious ledge, every step carefully placed to avoid sending loose gravel tumbling into the abyss. Wyatt insisted they take this route precisely because Crispin's men would never dream the fugitives could navigate such a trail. Ada's wound throbbed each time she had to brace herself against the rock, but she pressed on, refusing to voice any complaint. Lucy, her rifle slung across her back, also kept alert, scanning the jagged ridges for signs of pursuit. Eventually, the path widened into a plateau overlooking a deep gorge. There, Black Eagle appeared as if summoned by the wind itself. Harriet had heard Wyatt speak of a native scout he once assisted, but she hadn't expected to see him emerge so silently. Clad in buckskins that matched the winter browns of the landscape, the scout carried a short bow and wore a stoic expression. "He's a friend," Wyatt assured the women. "We helped each other once. I wired him weeks back to see if he'd keep an eye on Crispin's movements." Black Eagle nodded respectfully, then spoke in a measured tone. "Crispin Wilcox's men are everywhere in the low passes. They watch the main roads, but they don't know these high trails." His dark eyes flicked to Harriet. "Ada and Lucy, Wyatt told me. You 3 have reason to fight Crispin. He's a sickness. Better to cut it out than let it spread. Ada managed a grateful smile despite her aching body. We're willing, but Crispin holds an entire settlement in his grip. Many are loyal or else too afraid to resist. Harriet chimed in, pulling out her journal. We've gathered evidence of Crispin's corruption ledgers, testimonies, stolen resources. My plan was to bring it to the territorial judge, maybe in the next big town. But Crispin keeps intercepting travelers. I'm not sure we'll ever make it there alive. Black Eagle considered her words. The judge might help or might not. Sometimes these outsiders choose to ignore trouble in the high country. Crispin pays bribes too, from what I hear. Wyatt nodded ruefully. He's gotten away with this for too long. Lucy clenched her fists, frustration etched on her face. So we just hide in the hills forever. That can't be the end of it. Black Eagle raised a hand. No, we strike at Crispin's power. Show the people in the settlement that he's a liar and a coward, then they'll turn on him. If the settlement itself rejects him, Crispin's done. In hushed conversations by the plateau's edge, they laid out a plan to sabotage Crispin's ability to instill fear. Harriet and Lucy suggested distributing copies of Crispin's incriminating ledgers to key families in the settlement. If those documents circulated far enough, Crispin would lose his credibility. Ada proposed a bold infiltration slip into the settlement under cover of darkness. Hide some of the pages where Crispin's own men would find them, proof he'd been cheating. Even his loyalists. Wyatt frowned. It'll be dangerous. Crispin knows you three better than anyone. He'll have watchers everywhere, but none of them hesitated. They all understood that living in the mountains indefinitely as fugitives offered no real future. Harriet closed her journal. We do it, and maybe when Crispin sees his empire collapsing, he'll make a mistake that gives us our opening. Black Eagle nodded as though satisfied with the plan. We fight the wind with cunning, not brute force. Let Crispin's own lies be his downfall. The cold wind whipped around them, but in that moment each felt a stirring of warmth. They had a purpose bigger than mere survival, to free an entire community from Crispin Wilcox's iron fist. Night settled over the Wilcox settlement, a scattering of cabins, and a central church Crispin had erected like a monument to his own glory. At its highest point stood a wooden bell tower that Crispin used to call people to morning prayers, and occasionally to forced assemblies, where he preached about loyalty in the darkness beyond the settlement's perimeter. Harriet, Ada, Lucy, Wyatt, and Black Eagle gathered in the shelter of a pine thicket, finalizing their infiltration strategy. Ada's heart pounded as she peered at the familiar streets. She recalled walking those paths with Arthur, dreaming of planting fruit trees. Now the soil felt tainted by Crispin's tyranny. Lucy exhaled, adjusting the strap on her rifle. I can slip into the storehouse from the west. That's where Crispin likely keeps the official ledgers. If I find them, I'll swap in Harriet's pages to show the real numbers. Harriet flipped through her own notes, selecting the best pages revealing Crispin's financial double-dealings land, stolen from unsuspecting settlers, wagons raided under false pretenses. Wyatt ran his fingers over a revolver at his hip. I'll create a distraction near the stables. Once the commotion starts, Crispin's men will converge there, giving you time to plant those documents. Black Eagle, kneeling at the edge of the thicket, outlined a different maneuver. I'll circle around to the riverbank. 2 of my people are waiting there with canoes. If you have to flee, follow the river south. Crispin's patrols rarely check the water at night. Harriet's heart panged with anxiety. She had taught half the children in this settlement to read and write. Was she now preparing to wage a form of war against neighbors she once trusted? But Crispin's cruelty had transformed neighbors into captors, and Harriet could not let sentiment stand in the way of justice. They moved with the stillness of predators. Lucy crept alongside Ada, guiding her to the storehouse. The wooden structure creaked underfoot, but they managed to crack open a side door. Lantern light flickered from a far corner where a single guard dozed, rifle propped against a barrel. Lucy mouthed a silent command for Ada to stay low. Harriet, meanwhile, skirted the church's backyard, looking for another door that might lead to Crispin's private study. That was where Crispin had hidden incriminating correspondences, letters from merchants in distant towns who paid Crispin to keep roads blocked, extorting travelers who passed through. Wyatt waited behind the stables until he heard a faint rustle from the yard. Black Eagle's signal that the infiltration was underway. He snatched a torch from a sconce and plunged it into a pile of straw. Flames erupted. Almost instantly, a stable hand shouted, and an alarm bell started clanging. Crispin's enforcers rushed out, guns drawn. Wyatt retreated just far enough to keep them chasing his silhouette through the gloom away from Harriet, Ada, and Lucy's real objectives. In the storehouse, Lucy rummaged for Crispin's ledgers, hard hammering as the half-asleep guards stirred. With trembling fingers, Ada fished out Harriet's copies and replaced the pages in Crispin's books. She carefully inserted enough genuine entries to match the handwriting. If Crispin's men read these, they'd see how Crispin had siphoned off supplies for himself. If Crispin discovered the ruse too soon, it would only confirm that the documents were real. Outside, Harriet found Crispin's study window latched. She jimmied it open with a knife slipping inside. The room smelled of cigar smoke and old ink. On his desk lay an ornate Bible Crispin used for public sermons, a silver money clip stuffed with bills, and a cluster of letters Harriet recognized as evidence of Crispin's deals with unscrupulous traders. She pocketed the letters and replaced them with false missives, describing Crispin's betrayal of his closest allies. Let them read these in confusion and fury. Then a thunderous shot echoed through the night. Harriet's blood turned cold. Crispin Wilcox himself must have realized something was amiss. Harriet froze by Crispin's desk. Letters clutched to her chest. Footsteps thundered in the hallway. Someone barked Crispin's name, warning him of intruders. For a moment, Harriet considered hiding under the large oak desk, but the voices sounded dangerously close. Instead, she forced the window open again and dropped quietly into the alley below. A cry of alarm resounded from the stable yard. Wyatt must still be drawing Crispin's men away, but not all of them had taken the bait. She crouched behind a stack of crates, noticing Ada peering around the corner of the storehouse. Lucy was nowhere in sight, presumably finishing her part of the ruse. Harriet signaled Ada to join her, but Crispin himself emerged from a side door of the church, flanked by two armed men. Crispin's face contorted with fury in the lantern light. He wore a dark overcoat that made his tall frame look even more imposing. Harriet was struck by how quickly he transformed from that silver-tongued preacher who once welcomed new settlers. Now he stood like a warlord barking orders at his men. Find them, they can't have gotten far. If the women are alive, they'll regret showing their faces here. His enforcers nodded and scattered. Ada glanced down at her bandaged arm, then at Harriet's anxious expression. We have to distract Crispin away from Lucy, she whispered. Harriet nodded. They ducked around the corner, slipping into an adjacent alley, then deliberately made a noise by tipping a small barrel. Sure enough, Crispin spun in their direction, cursing as he charged forward. Harriet locked eyes with him for a split second, reading the shock that he hadn't been rid of them after all. She and Ada darted between cabins, Crispin and at least one guard hot on their heels. Meanwhile, Lucy crept out of the storehouse, undetected, the incriminating ledgers firmly swapped. She signaled from behind a woodpile to Harriet, who was weaving through the gloom. Harriet pointed Lucy toward the river, pantomiming the route that Black Eagle had described. Ada hesitated, torn between following Lucy or covering Harriet. Crispin's voice cut through the darkness again. You can't hide forever, Ada. Arthur's gone. There's no one left to save you. Give up now. Ada's jaw clenched. She aimed her pistol into the shadows where Crispin's voice echoed. The muzzle flashed and Crispin let out a startled curse, diving behind a rain barrel. Harriet seized the opportunity to grab Ada's sleeve and pull her around a corner. They stumbled upon Lucy, who waved frantically for them to follow. Flames from Wyatt's distraction spread through the stable roof, painting the settlement in a lurid glow. Shouts of villagers echoed as some tried to douse the fire. Crispin's men, however, were more concerned with hunting intruders. All the chaos played into their plan. Harriet, Ada, and Lucy raced toward the small trail leading to the riverbank, where they hoped to find Black Eagle waiting with canoes. Halfway there, two men lunged from the darkness. One was Crispin's loyal thug, who recognized Lucy immediately. Ada, quick on the draw, fired a shot that grazed his shoulder, while Harriet kicked the other man's shin. Lucy finished him with a swift rifle butt to the jaw. The scuffle was brutal but brief, leaving both men groaning on the ground. They heard Crispin's bellow behind them, commanding more of his guards to scour the area. With hearts hammering, they sprinted down the embankment. Sure enough, Black Eagle stood by the swirling current. Get in, he urged, pointing to two narrow canoes Harriet and Ada shared. One boat, Lucy took the other with Black Eagle. They shoved off into the frigid water, arms trembling with exertion. Crispin's men appeared on the bank, firing blindly, but the night soon swallowed the fugitives, carrying them downriver with stolen documents that threatened to unravel Crispin's entire regime. Safe on a gravel shore miles downstream, Harriet, Ada, Lucy, Black Eagle, and Wyatt assembled under a stand of willow trees. The canoes scraped the rocks, and everyone collapsed onto the bank, breathless from their mad flight. The swirl of the river all but drowned out the clamor of Crispin's men far behind Lucy, clutched at her side, having taken a hard fall while pushing off from the bank. But her eyes shone with fierce triumph. "Did you see Crispin's face?" she asked between gulps of air. "He's never looked so furious." Wyatt gave a tight nod. "He'll be gunning for us harder than ever, but that was worth it. We managed to plant the damning ledgers right." Harriet rummaged in her pack, confirming she still had the stolen letters Crispin used to coordinate trade extortion. "And we have these," she said. "More evidence combined with the false entries we left behind. Crispin will have to explain serious inconsistencies. The settlement won't be so quick to believe his lies now." Ada, leaning against a willow trunk, pressed a hand to her throbbing arm. Her bandage had come loose, oozing fresh blood from the night's exertions. "Let me," Lucy said, kneeling down to help rewrap the wound with one of Wyatt's spare bandages. Black Eagle stood watch, gazing downriver for any sign that Crispin's men might have pursued them by boat. "They won't catch up tonight," he said quietly, "but Crispin may send riders to cut us off farther south." Wyatt agreed. "We'll need a new hideout, one that Crispin's men don't know. There's an abandoned mining shack a day's ride from here. We can rest there, gather any allies who might be ready to oppose Crispin openly." Harriet fingered the letters, her eyes flickering with worry. "We need a plan for how to distribute these documents widely enough that Crispin can't silence all of them. Maybe we can send riders in multiple directions, giving copies to traders or traveling pastors. Crispin can't follow every lead at once." Lucy nodded. "The settlement's bigger families like the Millers, Carsons, and Drapers were always suspicious of Crispin. They just didn't dare say so. If we get these documents to them, they might finally stand up to him." Ada listened, every fiber of her being longing for Crispin to face the consequences of Arthur's death. She recalled Crispin's taunting words replayed in her mind. He had grown used to terrorizing them. But now Crispin found himself on the defensive for the first time. "He'll try to root out any traitors inside the settlement." Ada said softly, "We should be ready to help them if they're in danger. Some might run for the hills like we did." Black Eagle turned from his watch. "My people can guide refugees through hidden trails to safer land. But Crispin's men carry rifles and they have no qualms about violence." Wyatt grimaced at the thought. "We'll do what we must. If Crispin tries to mobilize a militia, we'll intercept them." It's not just about evidence anymore. It's about protecting those who want to leave. Silence fell among the group. Only the river's gentle rush and the creak of willow branches filled the night. Harriet breathed deeply, mustering her courage. They had struck a blow against Crispin Wilcox, but it was far from decisive. "We've become more than survivors," she thought. "We're a resistance." She tore a piece of blank paper from her journal and by lantern light began sketching a rough strategy for distributing the documents to various families. Lucy read over her shoulder, occasionally offering a suggestion. Ada reached out to steady Harriet's trembling hand, giving a small squeeze of solidarity. Before dawn arrived, they agreed on their next steps. Wyatt would guide them to the old mining shack, while Black Eagle scouts would slip back to monitor the settlement. Harriet and Lucy would copy out every incriminating page they could, ensuring multiple sets existed. Ada would rest her injured arm, gathering her strength for the next confrontation. In the pale moonlight, their resolve solidified like cairn. Crispin's era of fear was nearing its end, if they could only keep themselves and the evidence alive long enough to see his downfall. A gray dawn broke over the makeshift camp near the willow grove, illuminating tired faces that yet shone with resolve. Mounting their horses with renewed determination, Harriet, Ada, Lucy, Wyatt, and Black Eagle started on the winding route toward the abandoned mining shack. Along the way, they found more signs that Crispin's control was cracking. A small family of settlers, father, mother, and 2 children, stumbled across their path, frightened and hungry. They had fled the settlement overnight after Crispin's men demanded their oldest son join a militia being raised to find and kill the so-called traitors. Harriet gave them bread from her own meager rations, explaining that Crispin's reign of terror would soon be challenged by a coalition that refused to kneel. Black Eagle volunteered to lead them to a safer hideaway. This family would not be the last. By midday, the group reached the mining shack perched on the flank of a pine-dotted slope. The weathered boards and half-collapsed roof testified to its years of neglect, but it still offered a roof and basic shelter. Wyatt scouted inside to make sure no hostile strangers were lurking. When he returned, he declared it empty. Just a few rusted tools and a broken cot. They quickly set about reinforcing the door, Sweeping out the worst of the debris and covering the holes in the roof with scavenged planks, Ada sank onto a bundle of old blankets. Exhaustion and pain etched into her face. Harriet busied herself boiling water to brew a medicinal concoction from the herbs Wyatt had gathered, plants with antiseptic properties that would reduce Ada's swelling and ward off infection. Lucy took advantage of the daylight to sharpen her knife, a quiet ritual that gave her focus. Wyatt kept his eyes peeled on the mountain trail rifle in hand, as if expecting Crispin's riders at any moment. In a dark corner of the shack, Harriet and Lucy set up a makeshift desk. They spread out Crispin's letters, Harriet's journal, and the stolen ledger pages. They spent hours painstakingly copying the incriminating details onto separate sheets so multiple families could read the truth about Crispin's conspiracies. Harriet's handwriting, once used for classroom assignments, now became a weapon of truth. Lucy applied the stealth she'd learned in the wilderness to keep each copy hidden in a different satchel. If Crispin's men ever captured one, said the others would remain. As dusk approached, Wyatt lit a small lantern to illuminate the shack's interior. Ada, bolstered by Harriet's herbal brew, insisted on helping roll extra bandages. "We'll need them," she said wryly, thinking of future skirmishes. Harriet paused in her writing to observe that the entire group had changed. She recalled how Ada once sobbed every night for Arthur, how Lucy's naive gaze had hardened into a relentless commitment, how Wyatt, haunted by Crispin's past betrayals, now channeled his guilt into unwavering resolve, and how Harriet herself had transformed from a cautious teacher into a strategist, forging Crispin's undoing line by line. At last, Harriet set down her pen, flexing cramped fingers. She rose, carrying a stack of carefully copied letters to Wyatt. "This is how Crispin falls," she declared softly, "when the settlement sees how he sold them out, extorting goods and hiding the profits. They'll realize the holy man they followed is just a tyrant." Wyatt nodded, touching the brim of his hat in agreement. "We've got the spark, now we fan the flames." Outside, the night chill settled, and a few snowflakes drifted from the sky. Another frontier winter was coming, but for Crispin Wilcox, it might as well be the final storm that swept away his empire of lies. Clutching those damning documents, Harriet breathed deeply, letting the cold air fortify her spirit. She thought of all the exiles, including themselves, who had been left to die in the wild. They were still here, still alive, and about to unleash a truth Crispin could not bury. And that was enough to keep her warm through any blizzard. From my perspective, this remarkable story proves that hope shines brightest when darkness closes in. We've seen how Crispin Wilcox's tyranny collapsed under the weight of truth and the bravery of those he once deemed powerless. Harriet, Ada, Lucy, and their allies have not only survived his cruelty, but transformed their trials into a catalyst for justice and unity. The settlement, once gripped by fear, now stands as a place where honesty and cooperation triumph over lies and intimidation. I hope you feel uplifted by the grit and heart each character showed along the way. If you have thoughts about the transformations, the moral lessons, or the frontier setting itself, I invite you to share them in the comments. Your insights and opinions make these stories even richer, so let's keep the conversation going.